We are streaming on YouTube right now, but all the questions and comments will be handled here on Zoom. So thanks very much, Safiya, for being here, and I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to this entire team who's put this together, Jilly and everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. I noticed that just in the time that you were introducing me, the sun is shining in so brightly on me that it's partially blinding, but it's fine. I'm gonna keep going. And as I share my screen and kind of get ready, I wanna say that one of the things that is kind of most beloved to me about my work with my colleagues in the UK is both getting to be a co-editor with Melanie on feminist media studies, which is a giant job. And I know that we invite anyone who's here participating to please submit current and timely essays to us, because we really want to amplify so many voices, especially voices outside of the United States. And, you know, my other beloved UK connection, besides Sarah Benet-Weiser, who's here on the call, is Meghan and Harry, because, you know, they somehow just found my work. And I don't know if any of you saw that, but I have to actually be excited about that for a minute, because it is Meghan and Harry. So I'm here from Meg's hometown, LA, with you today. And I'm really just so honored and thrilled to get to share my work with all of you. As we were kind of setting up and getting ready this morning, I was sharing with Melanie and Jilly that the upside of the terrible times that we're in of COVID-19 is that I feel like I'm able to connect so much more with more people in ways that if I had to get on a plane and travel, I just would be so precluded from so many opportunities to meet you and connect with you and learn, quite frankly, with you. So I'm excited about having a conversation with you today. And what I thought I would do is share a few of the headlines from the book Algorithms of Oppression, because that has been the song that I have been singing for the past few years. I try to tell my students that when you write a dissertation, it's likely to be the project that you turn into your book. And so, you know, like Whitney Houston and The Greatest Love of All, you better love that song, because it's going to be a song that everybody wants to hear you sing. So I'm going to share a little bit about the book, but I also want to talk about kind of the new work and new things that I'm thinking about. And that really is about taking on big tech. In many ways, when I started writing the book, Algorithms of Oppression, I don't know. I guess I knew that I was really challenging the paradigm that Google has put into the world around, you know, its version or vision of controlling the information and knowledge landscape. And, you know, I was interested in this because I come from the field of library and information science, where we're concerned with you know, the future of knowledge, for example, whose knowledge. We understand the subjectivities, for example, of who gets to collect and categorize and make available knowledge and who doesn't, which voices are included. And of course, in our field, there's still such a deep and long, protracted struggle around surfacing different epistemologies into collections that can be found and known in the future. And this is why our work is so important in terms of writing and making our ideas available in all of these different kinds of scholarly domains. But of course, as we do that work, what we're seeing is the entire paradigm of how to come to understand and make sense of the world is being increasingly mediated by big technology companies. No longer are students starting in the library to inquire. I have students, unfortunately, who tell me that the only time they're in the library is to meet with study groups or to take a nap. We're seeing university libraries in particular who are starting to remove books out of the physical building and warehouse them such that you have to kind of call them up through an order, and then they're made available, which means more and more databases are kind of over determining what people will find. And there's many, many deep flaws with that kind of logic and the mechanics technically of doing that. And I'm happy to talk about that too. That's a super, super nerdy dimension of my work that it's not for everyone. So I'm happy in the Q&A if you want to talk about that to do so. So let me just say that, there have been so many headlines about algorithms and AI over the past at least 5 years solidly. I was a bit taken aback, Melanie, when you mentioned that Financial Times quote about my book, because I remember when it was under review and it was getting ready to go to press, and in the kind of very early days, the landscape was very different than it is today. I mean, even though I had been able to amass all of this evidence of the harms of Google and other platforms toward women in particular, and other kind of women of color and girls of color and vulnerable people, it was a time when the world was not actually in agreement with, we hadn't entered what the Financial Times in 2018 declared the techlash, right? This was their word of the year. We weren't in a space and a time when the headlines from the New York Times and the Guardian and all of these places were constantly showing us the ways in which algorithms were discriminating or wrongfully accusing or precluding people, as you know so well in the UK, precluding people from an opportunity to go to the university. So it's been phenomenal to, in the best and the worst ways, to see these conversations become mainstream. It's so important because if we can't talk about and make sense of with granular, kind of detailed, specific stories about algorithmic harm and discrimination or oppression, we really can't apprehend it. But at the same time, the fact that we have more and more evidence amassing, to me, is deeply worrisome and troubling. And I think that every major industry now is deeply implicated in the way in which they're making algorithmic decisions, whether it's deciding who gets a kidney transplant or who doesn't, using health data in disparate ways. Of course, one of the things that's so important to know, and we certainly should talk about this, are the ways in which legacy data sets so profoundly inform the way in which automated decisions happen. And of course, this is one of the areas that I've been watching so closely, which is, a decade ago when we talked about data and the way in which data was used to train machine learning algorithms, for example, people would say to me, Safiya, it's actually impossible for algorithms or computing programs to discriminate, because computing is just math, and math can't be racist, right? Or math can't be sexist. And that's such a hyper reductionist way to think about the social dimensions of computing. And of course, this is what I'm interested in, and now so just amazed at how many students are interested and are cultivating their entire careers in the context of like socio-technical systems and really deeply learning about the social dimensions. But a decade ago, when you had these conversations, and I remember with my engineering and computer science students who were just so defensive about any possibility that there were politics imbued in the work that they were doing. It was just kind of almost incomprehensible. And in fact, the prevailing logic was that it must be user error, you're just not using the program right. You're not using the racist soap dispenser right. You're not, you are not doing what needs to be done. And now, of course, those logics, I think, have really been, upended, and we're able to talk in a much more sophisticated, nuanced way about these social dimensions of technology. For those of you, though, who still encounter people who want to take the hyper reductionist model toward computing, this idea that math can't be racist, I try to give the metaphor that, in some ways that's like saying that human beings are really just cells. And, on one level, that is true. We are just cells. But at another level, that really, of course, obfuscates the humanity and the dimensions of the human experience that we're talking about. And so this is what I'm really talking about in my own work, are the social dimensions. It's not just computing, but it's computing the minute human beings are engaging with it, whether that's making it, programming, developing, or using. And of course, that also includes the full life cycle of technologies. And we certainly can talk about that too. Now, since June of this year and the uprising in the United States around the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, so many, just truly many Black people who've died at the hands of the state, we have really had so many requests into our center at UCLA. I think someone might have their mic on. Great, thank you. I think, we've had a lot of requests at our center at UCLA. We've just started a new Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, where we're trying to make space for feminist and kind of critical theories of power, race, gender, sexuality, and the internet, and doing that kind of research that centers vulnerable people. Since we've been doing that, we've had many requests from industry, from academia, from students who are trying to better understand issues at the intersection of race and technology. And so this is just a small handful of books that I think are very important for people who are interested in these conversations. And all of these books are really, in different ways, I think, counter-narrating histories of technology, of computing, of users of technology. I think back to Craig Watkins' early work around studying African-American teenagers and the way in which they were, in fact, power users of technology. And I don't know what the sweet spot is to get the sun out of my face, but we're going to just see what happens here. All the way through to, people like Dr. Ruha Benjamin and her latest work, Race After Technology and Captivating Technology. Many of us have been, again, I think, writing, but one of the things that we constantly see, and I know that many of you on this in this seminar also know, that the kind of erasure of feminist voices, the erasure of Black people from our narration and our research about computing is really important to capture and recover. So, these are books that I just want to put on your radar, that I think some of them are older history books and some of them are newer kinds of summations of what's happening in the field. But there's really something here for everyone who's interested in computing. And I think that what it also demonstrates is that there's a powerful new canon that is being built around the intersection of race and technology, especially kind of critically oriented. Here you'll see Black Software by Charlton McElwain, our friend and colleague at NYU. And in the US, and he's really helped us to organize a group called the Critical Race and Digital Studies Center at NYU. And for people who are interested and who are doing work that's kind of critical race and the digital. This is an important group. I think also kind of internationally for people who are often isolated. I know many times I'll meet kind of that one or two or three people of African descent in particular who are in the UK who are trying to do work around race and not finding necessarily an intellectual community to do that work. Please send them to meet us at NYU and let us help support them in their discovery. I've also, I want to kind of share some of these other pieces that I've written besides Algorithms of Oppression, because they really, I think, are what I'm trying to do is help scaffold up what I think of as kind of a intersectional Black feminist technology studies, a domain where we can do this kind of work and where people can engage. And there are so few Black women in particular who are in this field. I mean, I think in my field, specifically in library and information science, I mean, we're kind of guesstimating there might be about 20 Black PhDs in the whole United States. So it's a very small field. And what we're finding are, relationships with people in communications, in media studies, in gender studies, obviously, and increasingly in ethnic studies, who are interested in thinking about feminist technology studies. And so one of the things that feminist scholars have really been able to do, I think, is speak back so powerfully to the paradigm of the kind of great men of computing, which is the prevailing logic, or has been for many of us, to kind of be trained in and around. And one of the things that I think is so important about a feminist critique of computing is that it allows us to do the kind of work that we've been doing for a long time, which is thinking about things like communities and systems and structures. And one of the things that I think is so important when I think about like the kind of current and future work is the degree to which global communities are implicated and harmed by the current logics. So for example, this first article, I talk about what does it mean for us to uncritically ignore the people who extract minerals that are so necessary to make a variety of different kinds of computing devices. And of course, these follow the same kinds of colonial patterns of other types of innovations, whether it's in the automotive industry and the extraction of rubber from places like the Congo, or it's the extraction of coltan and copper and gold and other kinds of minerals that are needed for microprocessing chips. All the way through to disposal. What does it mean that when we're done with, iPhone 27, that it goes into what we think of as a recycling center, but truly it gets loaded up on a barge and sent to places like West Africa, where we're seeing pristine, beautiful wetlands turned into toxic dumps for the electronics of the global north. So these are things that I think are really important also for us to kind of consider and put a tremendous amount of attention and focus on in our study. Also, I would say our own engagements with social media are often uncritical. I find that the unfortunate models, and I know many of you are writing about social media and its business models of engagement, where we know the most egregious kinds of content are often the kinds of content that goes viral. And here I'm thinking of Sarah Benet Weiser's work around kind of networked misogyny and the way in which communities are, communities of hate against women are mobilized and powerfully engaged because of the business models of social media as well, that really profit powerfully from deep networked engagement. And so thinking about how we will intervene upon those things, I think, is incredibly important. And more importantly, how we'll regulate and think about public policy with respect to these egregious, I think, business models. Here's another syllabus, just in passing, that I think of important works that you might also find important. All right, so what does it mean that we're here? I mean, this is really part of the first pass of results that I first began studying that led to the making of the book Algorithms of Repression. And it was really thinking about, what did it mean that when you did a search on the keywords Black girls, all the way back, you can see almost 10 years ago, that the first page of results was almost exclusively pornography. There is, of course, the exception here of the Black girls, which you see the number 2. I can't help myself because you all are in the UK, but the Black Girls here is a UK band of white guys who call themselves the Black Girls. And everywhere I go, I always ask people, like, how many of you have heard of the Black Girls? And almost, I think I've had in a decade, probably less than 10 people who've ever heard of this band, but they've, powerfully, years ago, were able to kind of monopolize 2 positions here on the first page of results. Now, this is a really interesting artifact to me to study and kind of look at these results. The Markup, which is an investigative journalism outfit here in the United States that was started by Julia Angwin and Jeff Larson and others, who have done very important investigative journalism work around the harms of things like predictive analytics, recidivism prediction software, and other kinds of harms of big tech. Their team replicated this precise study this summer. And one of the things that they found, and of course, this was part of what I tried to talk about in the book, was that the kind of profit imperative of allowing, let's say, the porn industry, which pays Google a lot of money, and also other kinds of industries that are able to optimize keywords in the keyword planning tool and AdWords, has really allowed Google to make so much money, again, off of those who are most likely to pay or willing to pay, and those, of course, who have technical skill. In this case, I would argue that the Black Girls, the UK band, had more technical skills in optimizing their content to the first page of search results than they did in music distribution. It's fine. But when the Markup looked at these exact results, or this kind of searching on the keywords Black Girls this summer, they found that in the keyword planning tool, the same, really not much had changed. You still could optimize on that phrase, Black Girls, and when you optimized, you were more likely to be linked up. Or Google's keyword planning tool was more likely to recommend pornographic words or hypersexualized words in relationship to the phrase Black Girls. And of course, we know that for Latina girls and Asian girls, this is still prevailing. So even though we do this work, I think, as feminist media studies scholars, trying to talk about and expose through our research these logics, they actually cannot be fixed. We've seen the suppression of pornography and the kind of downranking in Google search on this phrase. But again, on the back end, there's still a tremendous amount of money to be made, and those logics indeed have not been changed. And I think this is really important when we think about how those logics work and making those things visible. Now, obviously, these ideas about the hypersexualization of Black women and girls is not new. And this is where I go back to, my kind of opening salvo about working in the field of library and information science. One of the things that we try to do in that field is also counter-narrate around racist stereotypes and ideas and tropes. In the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, which is at Ferris University, it's an excellent digital museum that I highly recommend. It seems like it doesn't matter what courses I'm teaching, I find a way to assign my students to go and look at this museum, mostly because they often don't really understand these legacy stereotypes and racist and sexist ideas about Black women and girls and people of color, more broadly, Black people in the United States. This is always incredibly important, let's say, to assign in October before Halloween so that they understand things like the long racist legacy of practices like blackface. But you can see here that the kind of early kind of colonial markers and depictions and artifacts about African peoples persist and have stayed with us through contemporary American and European and even Asian histories. So you might go anywhere in the world, in fact, and come across this kind of racist memorabilia, which, you know, in the States we call like Americana, but truly it is the kind of dehumanizing imagery that serves to, I think, bolster a desensitizing of the public toward racialized people, and especially racialized and gendered people. And so these are, I think, important through lines to remember that what happens in the digital is not just a mirror, but it's actually a more powerful amplification. What happens in the digital is that these kinds of tropes and racist stereotypes that many of us are thinking about and studying in television, film, radio, and other places is actually exponentially amplified through the internet, and many times with the speed and scale that is just kind of incomprehensible. So in newer work, I've been thinking much more about the way in which social inequality obviously will not be solved by an app, and putting a lot of pressure on foundations and other kinds of organizations that have been really deeply invested in kind of techno solutionism, that somehow we will just, what we need is a better search engine, what we need is a better set of technologies. And for sure, we do need that. There's no doubt. I mean, even in the end of algorithms of oppression, one of the things that I say is that we need to break up the monopoly control of a company like Google to and have many, many kinds of search engines. I've been really thrilled. Just for the last 24 hours, I've been promoting on Twitter, a group called Feminist AI, for example, here in Los Angeles, that is, like many feminist organizations, struggling for resources. And so I want you to know about them. But one of the things that's been so profound about their work is that they really center feminist, Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ, and trans ways of knowing into the kinds of computing, AI, and machine learning projects that they take up. So they're very experimental. And one of the things that's so powerful is that I think their work underscores for us that it isn't just about kind of the same epicenters of techno-determinism. And this is where I think of places like MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, Illinois, where I hail from, who now have put themselves in charge of ethics, right? The same people who gave us the profoundly discriminatory and unethical technologies have also put themselves in charge of ethics. And I definitely want to discuss this with you, obviously in the wake of the firing of Timnit Gebru, who's the top AI ethicist at Google, Ethiopian woman who was just fired this last Thursday, for pointing out the harmful dimensions of machine learning and natural language processing data sets that Google was using. The whole notion that we are somehow going to app or technology innovate our way out of the deep kind of structural inequality in our society is just, to me, ludicrous. We absolutely need more experimental feminist technology innovation. But I think we have to also pair that with immediate and deep shifts in public policy. When we think of things like global wealth inequality, the racial wealth gap, the way in which women make 60 to 70% of what men make. These are policy issues that we have to attend to, that have to do with, of course, transforming capitalism and the way in which it is a predatory economic system. So I think these are the things that I try to put intention in my work, is just really not just the kind of techno-solutionism. Since COVID-19, one of the things that we've seen is just the loss of more and more public goods to big tech. And of course, this includes our privacy and the ways in which communities are pushing back on things like contact tracing and are deeply distrustful of the state. I think it's, I am always reminded by my students that for them, that's very difficult for them to see any differentiation between large corporations and the state. And so when we even talk about things like public goods, this is increasingly a notion that's being lost on younger and younger generations who have less access to public goods, or who are not like us Gen Xers, raised in the possibilities of what public goods did for us. And so I'll give you examples. I mean, my students forget that the library is a public good, that they don't have to buy every single text that they want to read from Amazon, that there's a different model indeed that exists that is about shared resources, and that privatization doesn't have to over-determine what they can do and what they can experience in life. One of the things that's been so interesting, and by interesting, I mean terrible, to watch since March and the lockdown that we've had here in California, is the way in which the tech sector has been the only sector to make billions of dollars during this global crisis of coronavirus. What we see is the fragility of all of our public systems. And again, I know that this is more of a US phenomena, but this idea that public education, public higher education, certainly public health, is so fragile in the United States. And the coronavirus has really laid bare just how fragile these systems are. I'm looking now at trying to gather the data on how much spending, for example, universities have done, kind of starting in the UC system, the University of California system, to see. My hunch from the things that I'm seeing kind of ethnographically is that we're spending more money on IT solutions than we are on things like academic instruction, which is, salaries for professors, teaching assistants, graduate students, clinical faculty. And so these are the kinds of I think questions we have to ask ourselves about how it is that big tech has created indeed many of the conditions that we are dealing with in terms of the fragility of our systems. And part of the way they've done that is by not paying taxes, by offshoring their profits, by not reinvesting back into our kind of collective systems. And so these are the kinds of things that I just think are so important for us to study going forward, and to also resist and use that research to inform policymakers. My latest book that I'm kind of, I've just sent a proposal in, so crossing fingers that everything will go forward, is trying to think about historicizing the internet differently than we've kind of come to know it, with the exception, quite frankly, of feminist technology studies scholars. And of course, I think about people like Judy Wayman and others who have done such important work in helping us develop a kind of feminist alternative history and understanding of the rise of the internet. But I'm also looking at other paradigms. So thinking about what an abolitionist stance looks like in the face of big tech. And this is where I look to other moments in history. So what is it about, for example, Big Cotton and the transatlantic slave trade and the discourses that surrounded those moments, where people actually used very similar argumentation that they use today, which is to say, we could never abolish the institution of slavery, or we could never abolish colonialism or the transatlantic slave trade, because the entire empire is built upon it. The entire economy would collapse. So what is it that, how were abolitionists able to dislodge that logic? And again, reminding us that it was a handful of people relative to the millions of people who benefited from colonization and the institutions of slavery in different countries. Millions of people kind of were bystanders or benefited, and were not active in shifting public policy around this and the moral consciousness. So what can we learn from those eras? Similarly, how do we learn from the era of big tobacco? When I'm talking to my students and I'm bringing this to a close here, I'll remind them that when I was born, I'm sure that the doctor had a cigarette hanging from his mouth. I'm sure the doctor had a cigarette hanging from his mouth when my mom was pushing me out. My mom, I'm sure, chain smoked 2 packs of cigarettes after she gave birth. I mean, that idea of the way in which big tobacco was such a cultural force in our lives for anybody born before the 1990s. We know that that is we live in a very different paradigm now with respect to big tobacco. Now, one of the failures of big tobacco was that while we regulated in the United States around the kind of use and heavy taxation, reparations, quite frankly, that the tobacco industry had to pay back to the public, that business moved to the global South, where there was little regulation. So we need to learn from that paradigm as well when we think about big tech. So this is kind of the emergent work that is happening, and I'm happy to talk about that with you too. So what are some of the things that I think we can think about or do? I mean, obviously we need to bring more kind of intersectional research streams to the fore in the study of computing. I mean, that's like a no-brainer. I think we need to be thinking about science and technology studies also into ethnic studies, African-American studies, gender studies, many places. We need to be hiring PhDs from these fields where we're thinking critically about race and gender to work on tech. And of course, this is a place where I think the move around AI and ethics has really shortchanged the more critical work that needs to happen, because there's kind of a bit of the profound kind of ethics washing that happens is because there aren't social scientists and humanists truly that are well credentialed at the table. And then of course, I think we need more centers of excellence and action that are visible to industry, academia, and the public. I'll leave it here and just say, we have more data and technology than ever. There was a really important study by the UK, I think it was the House of Commons, that reported that if we don't have public policy intervention, that by 2030, 2/3 of the world's wealth will be owned by the 1%. You think about that. I mean, when I talk to I have a girlfriend who's a millennial, a JD, and I'm always saying, what do they think? We're going to sit around and watch videos of other people eating? And she's like, I do that. And I was like, I'm not doing this with you. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, she's like, but so the acculturation, right? I guess that we'll all live on Soylent while we watch everyone else eat filet mignon. I don't know what these logics are, but I know that the data and technology and the kind of the promise, the alleged promise of that is a farce. And we're going to have to do a tremendous amount of work still in this space. So thank you so much for letting me share some of these thoughts.
Thank you, Safiya. That was so interesting because this is not my area of research at all. So my eyes have been well and truly opened. So we have about half an hour for questions. I know that Safiya has got a busy day ahead of her and something coming up after we wrap up here. So I don't want to keep her too long. So I'll open it up to the floor for questions. I have questions, maybe stupid questions because this is not my area, but I will open it up to our audience. So we can use mix of raise hand function and the chat box if you're not able to use your mic at the moment. That's fine. And sorry, I'm just trying to open up the participant window so I can see any raised hands. While we're waiting, actually, I'll go ahead and ask some stupid questions. Just this week, I was teaching my first year undergraduates about multiple histories of the internet. As I said, this is not my area of expertise, but it's a kind of introductory history module, introducing them to various histories of the media over the last sort of couple of hundred years. And, we asked them to watch a documentary about it as well. And we tried to sort of critically unpack, the particular perspective that was being given in this documentary about the history of the internet. And, it's very common for students to learn about, all these very clever, important white men who invented all this really important kind of hardware and infrastructure. And, they're all in the US, they're all studying at these big key universities. And then suddenly we have the internet and it's amazing. And now everyone has access to the internet. I'm just wondering if you teach your students about histories of the internet, and how do you do it? How do you offer these alternative kind of myth-busting perspectives?
That is such a great question. And that's actually in this new book, the whole kind of front half of it is more of a contextualizing of these kind of great men of technology stories with the broader, move around wartime technologies, for example, the histories of what was happening in the world. So this is one of the things that's really interesting. And we just had the 50th anniversary of the internet. There was a huge celebration last year in 2019 at UCLA because UCLA was one of the nodes in the early internet in the network. And I think that it's very important that people not tell the story of the internet just as a story of technological developments. Here we had TCP IP protocol, here we had computing storage increase, at this place, this man or this researcher worked on this dimension of the technical dimensions, because that is primarily the way in which the history of the internet is narrated. So we also have, for example, and this is where I'm so influenced by people like Vijay Prashad. I think about this next book being somewhere between Vijay Prashad's The Darker Nations and Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine and my own work, where you have, for example, this movement that's happening, the non-aligned movement, for example, that is organizing. It doesn't even become the non-aligned movement, but it's kind of like the until the 70s. But you have this kind of anti-colonial movement for political and social liberation from colonization that starts to happen around the world. And this starts getting organized as early as the 1930s, the 1920s, when people are talking about and trying to critique colonization. And they're also, scientists are, you have to remember, before the internet, the way scientists shared scientific knowledge is they mailed papers to each other in the mail, right? And they shared knowledge, and scientific communities in particular were very interested in innovation from any part of the world, right? But much of the kind of scientific knowledge production was also happening in service of kind of militarized technologies. So when you understand that by the US starts to get really concerned as we enter the Cold War about scientific knowledge falling into the hands of the third world, basically. And they don't want that. And so they're interested in thinking about how to sequester scientific knowledge and keep that contained with their allies, the US. So this becomes part of the impetus of the social and kind of political context of the internet, of the technical system of sequestering knowledge from other parts of the world. In particular, by the 1970s, the non-aligned movement and the third world liberation movements. This is a very important dimension of understanding the way in which the technology works, in whose service. It actually then starts to make very clear sense how US empire gets extended through a variety of different kinds of technology companies in the US, the ones that are name brands that we interact with right now. You start to see by the 1990s and 2000s that the US government is directly investing in companies like Facebook and Google. So you have In-Q-Tel, which is the VC fund of the CIA that is early investor in Google. You see national security figures who are deeply tied to the State Department and the CIA, who are early advisors on the ground floor to Google and its founders. So what is happening is that these companies become an arm of the state in ways that would be illegal for the state to actually do the kinds of things they're doing, the surveillance technologies, the data collection, all of these kinds of things. And these are happening, again, in relationship to US foreign policy and the politics of empire. And so I'm trying to right now kind of write this history because I think this is an important history for us to remember when we're talking about the origin stories of the internet. And I'm also welcome anyone that you know of that is also writing in this space that please share with me, because it's very important. The thing that we know is that there were women also in computing who were marginalized, and of course Mar Hick's book is so important, kind of on the history of British women in computing. I mean, her work is so important because the UK, she documents in her book, the UK had more women in computing early on than any other country. And because it was a feminized field, computing, the British government didn't invest in it. They actually almost completely shut it down because it's like, who cares? It's just like a bunch of women nerds. And of course, that powerfully set the UK back in terms of its own stake in kind of computing empire building. So these histories of what women were doing, what people of color were doing, what the political import was, and of course, the politics of sexism and racism are apparent. But there were also people who were trying to imagine other ways and who were also resisting. And I think those stories have yet to be documented fully.
Thank you, Safiya. I want you to hurry up and write this new book so I can use it in my teaching. And we've got comments coming in. I know a couple of people would like to ask a question as well. And you've had praise from Jilly and Tanya for, they've been using algorithms of oppression in teaching, and it's been really accessible for the students. Sarah Benet-Weiser would like to ask a question.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Safiya, for that great talk. I just want to echo Jilly and Tanya. I just had office hours today And every single one of them were questions about the essay question that I asked them to write about algorithms of oppression. So everyone is really talking about your book right now. Maybe the students are a little stressed out about it, but it's generating some really good questions. I want to echo Melanie. I can't wait for this new book. And this is really the first time I've had to talk to you about this new book. So I wanted to ask like kind of a broader question about it. So I think that it's so brilliant to tie these industries together, big cotton, big tobacco, big tech. And it's also very clear the ways in which those industries have absolutely depended on racialized labor, racialized consumers, gendered labor, gender consumers. Hicks's book in terms of big tech with the women in the computing field, of course, big cotton, and the ways in which this is an industry that relied, on racialized labor, tobacco, the labor of, the way in which big tobacco targeted women as consumers, but then also the global South. And so I think that's so brilliant. And I think that it will be, it's going to be super important to, like you said, myth bust. And situate big tech as an industry, straight up capitalist industry that has been shrouded by magic and all the things that it brings us that are sparkly and obfuscated and shiny, and that to kind of reveal this as an industry. So all that is saying, I can't wait for the book to come out. But I was also wondering, did you think about big pharma as part of this? Because that also seems to me to be this. I just had a conversation with a student today who's from the UK who had no idea how enormous that capitalist industry is and how it preys on people and exploits people in terms of their racial and gendered identity and location and everything else. And so, anyway, I was just wondering if that had come into, yeah.
Well, first I want to say, Sarah, that you were the first person. I'm going to just bust you out a little bit here to everybody. Sarah Binney-Weiser was the first person to read my book, when it was in the kind of galleys and just getting ready to come out. She saw the kind of production copy and was the first person to read it and to tell me that this book mattered. And, I will tell you that is also a practice among us that we do where we acknowledge each other's work, and that profoundly empowered me as I was terrified of being eviscerated when algorithms of oppression came out, because again, it came out at a time, or it was in development at a time when people were hostile to these ideas about naming the harms of big tech. So I just want to thank you publicly, Sarah, for your care with respect to my work and what a difference it's made for me over the years. It's
Safiya, if you could now introduce me to Meghan Markle, that would be enough.
I listen, noted. Okay. So, here's the thing about big pharma. I think it is absolutely relevant. And, I actually often will talk about big pharma when I'm talking to policymakers, giving the analogy a little bit differently. And I think you're right that big pharma is another industry that could be taken up and really considered. And if there's, and I want to do that. I think you're spot on in terms of the model. These are all kind of similar industry models with varying degrees of false promises, right? Or just enough there for us to believe in their efficacy, but then that shrouds the broader kinds of harms that happen. One of the things that's interesting, though, about big pharma, that the example that I often give to policymakers is that, when Jeff Larson and Julia Inquin went to North Point to talk to them about the recidivism prediction software that was predicting African Americans to be 4 times more likely to commit a crime if they were let out on bail. So you might be familiar with these kind of recidivism prediction software that are increasingly being used by courts around the world. When they first confronted like this early story that we heard about recidivism prediction software, and they confronted the makers, it was, I've heard Jeff Larson tell the story. He says, it was 3 guys in a strip mall who had rented some space and were just like coding predictive software that was determining whether people spent life in prison or not. And we brought the 15,000 cases, we brought the boxes of paper, and we showed them the disparate impact of their software, and they were in total denial. They didn't want to hear it. And then finally, they kind of broke them down and made them confront what they'd done with the software. And, when I heard them tell this story, I thought, we'd never let 3 guys rent some space in a strip mall and whip up some chemicals and roll it out nationwide in CVS and Walgreens and Duane Reade and Boots, it's Boots, right, in the UK, right? We'd never let that happen. And then when there's all this harm and all this damage and people die or people are debilitated by these drugs, we wouldn't turn around and just say, well, that's just chemistry. But that's actually the logic that prevails between big pharma and big tech, where big pharma does have at least a modicum of regulation, and there have to be clinical trials and there has to be a lot of proof. The burden is incredibly high for proving certain kinds of things. And of course, we know that the FDA and other kinds of regulatory agencies also are bought off. There's no question. But there is a paradigm that the public has with respect to how pharmaceuticals enter the market that is completely different than the paradigm that we're in with tech, even though tech has as dangerous kind of implications on our lives. So I think there is something there that's much more sophisticated to nuance that you're bringing to the table in this conversation. I really appreciate it.
We've got a question in the chat, and I know that Francesca and Jilly also would like to ask questions. But the question in the chat is from Sanjay Sharma, who says, in light of the Timnit Gebru sacking from Google, is the only way forward an abolitionist big tech perspective? At every level, we are so tied into big tech. For example, you're right, we are using Zoom and YouTube for this event. It seems impossible to disentangle ourselves from big tech unless it's dismantled and alternative tech for the people is made available.
Well, there's no question alternatives. We might, there are some people who are championing more kinds of like hyperlocal types of technologies where we, go back to the server in your closet model. I know that seems so, for some people, they think of that, of those ideas as like being, just like Luddite. But of course, I heard this beautiful interview of someone who wrote an amazing book about the Luddites, and that, what they did was, in fact, dismantle and try to resist the tools, the industrial tools that were bringing about their own demise. So let us not forget that there's a lot to learn from the Luddites. So I think that, yes, of course, these small scale, slow computing possibilities are certainly important to consider. The fact that we only have a couple of kind of monopoly choices is a huge problem. And this is something that, many of us who write about like the monopoly control of companies like Google and Facebook is important. Certainly, Commissioner Rohit Chopra of the Federal Trade Commission just wrote a minority opinion about Zoom and the kinds of data that it collects on us. That is very important for us to understand and to then use to make policy interventions. So all of that, of course, has to happen. We need more antitrust work. We need more technological development. There are even different kinds of computing paradigms. I mean, some of you probably follow the work of Twain Liu on Twitter, who is a feminist computer scientist, AI and kind of machine learning genius, who writes about the computing paradigms and logics of people like, that are predicated upon people like Aristotle, that are fundamentally racist and sexist from the origin story. So there's very interesting conversations that are happening about the development of technology and its logics, and that are happening and growing in different parts of the world that lead to different kinds of possibilities. And I think we need to have more of a transnational feminist collaborative model of learning about different kinds of logics that underpin our computing. So for sure that needs to happen, because the paradigm we're in is a race to the bottom. There's no question about that in my mind. I think the firing of Dr. Gabru was really telling. It's not a surprise, but I have to say that, I have a couple of thoughts. First, there are people of color who are entering the space of ethics and AI who are people of color and are women, but that does not mean that they are steeped in feminist or critical race or other theories of power necessarily. And I think that our work as social scientists and humanists to do that context making allows for people like Dr. Gabru and others to have more space to do their work. And I think that's really important. So we want to remember that, it isn't necessarily the role of the computer scientists and the machine learning and AI, our colleagues, to also go back and get PhDs in gender studies, although wouldn't that be awesome? But, it's for us to be at the table together and to really inform each other. So I think they have been more informed. People who are working computer scientists have been more informed by the work that we're all doing. And we've given more space to it. However, we want to remember that the radical political possibility around the firing of somebody like Timnit, and linking that with other workers, other tech workers around the world, is very, very important. So we have tech workers walking out of Amazon warehouses. We have Microsoft workers striking. We have Facebook and Google workers walking out, striking. We have workers who work in the mines in places like the Congo who are doing backbreaking work that are also tech workers. And I think what's important is for us to not fixate on elite white collar workers, but to show the link between elite white collar workers who will get sacked for talking about discriminatory data sets and how that is tied to other types of corporate practice in this sector. And to me, that is really, really important that we bring that into our analysis as we're talking about this firing. Otherwise, I think that, if the goal is just to get Google to make a nice statement about AI and ethics, we're just hosed here. I mean, we're just in the wrong register. So I'm excited. I mean, I know Dr. Gabru has got a lot of offers for work because she's a genius, and everyone's excited about getting her to come and work with them. And so, that's important. But of course, the resistance to truth-telling about the way computing is implicated in climate change and the way computing is really over-determining our futures through a variety of predictive analytics, the flaws of data sets that are fed to machine learning algorithms, all the way to the exploitation of line workers. These are all part of the same problem. Of the way in which all of us are expendable and disposable labor to capital. And we have to, I think, articulate that more powerfully than ever.
Thank you, Safiya. Francesca Sabande has a question about ethics washing and the erasure of Black scholarship and marginalised work.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say thank you for such an incredible talk and just all the work that you do. I know that I wouldn't be able to do the sort of research and pedagogical work that I've pursued without the work that you have done, and it's been a huge source of inspiration. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you. It really means a lot to be able to learn from you and to see how your work is continually developing and offering insights that are often absent. So the question I had was really to do with the relationship you see between ethics washing and the different ways that ethics is defined within various spaces that put forward an understanding of ethics that typically doesn't account for the lived experiences of Black people. And I was also thinking about when you spoke of the erasure of Black scholarship or the work of marginalized people, whether that's within scholarly spaces or outside of them, and if you see a connection between what's going on with ethics discourse and the erasure of particular people's work and activism.
100%. I mean, there's no question, and thank you for those lovely comments. I feel that I reciprocate that I could not do my work without the work of feminist scholars and students and our communities. So thank you. I think that ethics is one of the worst words to enter into the conversation, quite frankly. I regret that I even use the framing of ethics in any way. I used it interchangeably in my book around talking about social justice, racial justice, critiquing capitalism, almost with a naivete that that people would understand that that's what I'm talking about when I talk about ethics. And of course, since then, what people have done is they have depoliticized the critiques around oppression and defanged and neutered entirely the logics that we're talking about by focusing on ethics and morality. Now, this is a problem because many of us know the origin story of ethics kind of from let's say, starting with the Enlightenment or even starting before the Enlightenment, let's say in the kind of the origin stories of Western civilization that most high school students are taught and undergraduates. Well, that's an incredibly precarious and faulty set of histories upon which to unpack and critique the injustices, because we will remember that at the time that so many of the theories around ethics, social contract, and morality were coming into existence in the West, it was, at the same time as the expansion of American and British Empire, the cultivation, again, of the transatlantic slave trade and the institutions of slavery were all built during the same eras, right, of kind of occupation and, waxing on about ethics. So I think, we've got to figure out how to arrest the depoliticizing. And this is what the ethics washing to me is about. It's really about erasing the feminist critique, erasing the critiques about racial injustice and power. It's actually just moving away from a power analysis entirely and situating this in terms of our specific moral compass. And this is where then things like implicit bias training and other types of work get linked up with ethics, which for me are incredibly insulting and harmful to our ability to talk about this. I was actually joking around on Twitter about this a few days ago because this was a big conversation about AI and ethics that was going on there. And I was saying, pretty soon we're going to be in a place like talking about racism in our society, which is where colorblind ideologies have become so potent and so powerful that if you try to talk about and name racism and structural racism, people tell you you're the racist, right? Because like, how dare you? It's like the, Real Housewives meme, how dare you? So, You know, it's like, here we are. We're going to be in a point soon, I bet, where when someone says that technology is unethical, people say, how dare you call me unethical, right? And so it's like, this is not helpful. And I think this is where we've got to also, be mindful around how this is happening. I mean, my mind was blown, obviously, a couple of months ago this summer when Google announced that it was opening up an AI and ethics consulting practice. I mean, that was a head to desk moment for me, because it's like, how dare you? I mean, it's just not reasonable. But what that means is that the conversation about AI and ethics has been fully captured. And now every major consulting company and tech company has an AI and ethics division. And while there are some excellent people working in those spaces, when that conversation's been captured by the very people and companies we're trying to critique, then you know that we need new words to articulate what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I know Jilly had a question. I'm also very aware that Safiya is at the beginning of her working day today. I think this will be the last question. We can just squeeze it in to wrap it up. Jilly?
Hello, I'm sorry, I think my bandwidth might be a bit erratic, so I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, again, thank you so much, Safiya, for such a wonderful and thought-provoking talk, and I also can't wait for your new book. And my question was originally going to be about the Luddites, because I was wondering how they might kind of factor into this history, and particularly the ways in which, like, I was going to say I'm a Luddite because I can't find the raise hand function on Zoom. So I'm a Luddite, and we associate that with just being like anti-tech or technophobic or anti-futurist or just kind of anachronistic. And so I wonder if like a kind of this reclaiming of the history of the Luddites is it seems really, really important. And I don't know if you know Richard Seymour's book, the Twittering Machine, and he makes this, but asks the question about what a contemporary Luddism might be. And I was just wondering what like a contemporary feminist Luddism might be. But the question that I wanted to ask really was about how much sort of political will there might be for breaking up big tech. Because I know certainly in the UK context, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn a year ago, we're talking about the possibility of breaking up big tech, or at least taxing big tech in much more equitable ways, and that the Labour Party did not win the election, and this didn't seem to gain any traction. So I just wondered, and in the US context, I just wonder about the political will for it, and how it's maybe complicated by the fact that Trump is talking about breaking up big tech, but for very different reasons. And so I just wonder how you see this sort of fitting into a political picture and what possibilities there might be there.
Yeah, this is such a great question. I mean, I think there's more political will than there was in the last decade, for sure. Having said that, it probably isn't where we want it to be in terms of, even though we just had a change in administration in the United States with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris having been elected, they're already kind of appointing Eric Schmidt and other of the same actors into key advisory positions. So I, of course, am concerned about the capture of regulation, which is happening, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, all of the kind of CEOs of the top 5 tech companies have been now, positioning themselves as pro-regulation. Sarah Roberts, my colleague at UCLA who co-directs the center with me, has been writing about Section 230, but also revisions, which of course we know are going to happen in the US. But also the degree to which companies are writing in their own version of regulation into trade agreements. And this is really flying under the radar. So I think we have obviously we have a lot at stake. And while there seems to be some appetite truly among, for different reasons, I mean, fascist state actors want regulation so that they have more control over the way in which their political will is oriented and not stopped. That's really different than other ways in which people want to regulate from harm. So I think this is a very, a lot of people are using the same words. And so it becomes difficult to disambiguate what are we actually talking about. And so for me, this is why it's important. I mean, I remember when, people in the UK were trying to, get me to talk about how the internet is really like censoring conservatives. And I was like, well, except we don't have the evidence of that, because you just won Brexit, you just won the White House in the United States, you control the Supreme Court, you control the Senate. So we actually don't have evidence of harm. When I'm talking about evidence of harm, I'm not talking about that. So, we have to get, again, really specific. And I think the more that we document the communities and the people who are further disenfranchised economically, politically, that will help us to be very specific. And I think that's one of the things that's so important about scholarship, is that we're very specific in the words that we use and the framings that we invoke. And we need to play much, much more of a visible role with policymakers in terms of the digital. It's just crucial. And I will just say this, that the climate scientists now are reporting out that they wish they had been more active, more involved in shaping public policy with respect to climate change. What they thought is that they would do the research and just put it out there and that policymakers would know what to do with it. And now they realize that was a mistake, that they couldn't just be scientists. Here's the report. That was insufficient. They needed to do much, much more in terms of translation to the public and education of lawmakers. And I think the same is true for those of us who study the digital. We must take a much more active role in translating and disseminating our research findings so that the public can actually apprehend what's at stake and then run for office themselves. We know that when women run for office and when women are involved in politics, oftentimes the paradigms shift. So, that's important for us kind of to all link up in these ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Safiya. That's such a nice way to end this discussion, I think. Just a small task to leave us with at the end of this talk, task. So thank you so much again, Safiya, for coming and speaking to us today, all the way from LA at the very beginning of your working day, while the rest of us can all go to our home pubs, our quarantine pubs. Now we've finished. So thanks so much that you've given us loads of food for thought, and you've got some really lovely comments in the chat box there, praising your work and thanking you for today's talk. So I'm going to do the awkward applause thing that we do on Zoom now. But thank you so much. And yeah, I know you've got a busy day ahead of you, so we should let you go. But this has been a lovely way to finish our autumn series of talks for the Media and Gender Group. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Be well.
Bye, everyone.